I didn't sign up to be a caretaker for a cripple. That was the last thing my husband said to me before he threw a stack of divorce papers onto a chest that had just been shattered by shrapnel. I had left a piece of my own flesh and blood on the battlefield to drag two young soldiers out of a burning convoy, only to be discarded like a piece of defective machinery by the man I loved. He didn't even glance at our 3-month-old son crying in the bassinet next to my bed. He just turned on his heel and walked straight back to his mistress's apartment, leaving me there with a bleeding chest and a leg locked in a steel brace. 9 years later, when my son grew up and started to shine, that same man dragged me to court to steal him away. He was dead set on using my injuries to prove I was unfit, a broken veteran. But what he didn't know was that the classified military file he so smugly demanded the judge open would become his own death sentence, stripping away every lie he ever told. Before I tell you what happened, take a second to hit like and subscribe, but only if you actually want to hear this story. Also drop your location and local time in the comments. I really want to know where you're listening from. The harsh chemical stench of the Walter Reed burn unit hung thick in the air. Blinding camera flashes bounced off the sterile white walls. Richard sat next to my bed, his hand resting gently over mine. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, flashing a perfect practice smile at the local news crew. The ultimate hero on the home front. The devoted white-collar husband standing by his wounded warrior wife. The second the cameraman lowered his lens, the act dropped. Richard pulled his hand away like he'd touched a hot stove. He casually wiped his palm against his expensive slacks, avoiding my eyes. He hated the smell of iodine and burnt skin. He couldn't stomach the sight of the heavy steel halo drilled into my left shin. 2 days later, they transferred me to a local civilian facility back in Charlotte. The circus had packed up. No reporters, no cameras, just the low hum of the fluorescent ceiling lights and the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. Richard walked in just after lunch. He didn't take off his coat. He didn't pull up the plastic visitor's chair. He just stood at the foot of my bed, staring at me the way a guy stares at a totaled truck he knows he isn't going to fix. Slap. He tossed a thick manila envelope onto the plastic tray table. It slid across the slick surface and bumped into my water cup. I stared at the heavy brown paper. "What is that?" "Papers." His voice was flat, pure corporate transaction, like he was laying off a warehouse worker. My lawyer already signed off. I tried to draw a full breath, but the fractured ribs ground together, sending a hot spike of pain up my spine. "Papers for what, Richard?" He didn't flinch. "I can't do this, Julia. Look at you." He flicked his chin toward the heavy metal wheelchair parked in the corner of the room. The gesture was casual, quick, and loaded with absolute disgust. It felt worse than the blast wave that had ripped through my convoy. "You're leaving," I rasped. My throat felt dry, coated in dust. "Now. I have a career, a life. I didn't sign up to change bedpans or push a cripple through a grocery store." He checked his Rolex. "The house goes on the market next week. I'll have my assistant pack your stuff and send it to your brother's place." I shifted my gaze to the clear plastic bassinet a few feet away. Leo was sleeping, his tiny chest rising and falling under a thin hospital blanket. "And your son?" "Child support will hit your account on the 1st of every month," Richard said coldly. He was already backing toward the door, calculating his exit strategy. "It's more than enough. Don't make this ugly, Julia. You know damn well you can't afford a fight." He didn't wait for an answer. He grabbed the handle, stepped into the hallway, and let the heavy door click shut. Silence settled over the room like wet concrete. It pressed down on my chest, suffocating and heavy. I didn't cry. Crying was a luxury I left in the dirt back overseas. Then, a whimper. Leo woke up. The soft sound quickly escalated into a sharp, hungry wail. I looked at my son. Then I looked at the red nurse call button taped to the bedrail. I could press it. A stranger in scrubs would come. She would look at the manila envelope, look at my steel leg, and pity me. No. I gritted my teeth. I clamped my right hand around the cold metal of the bedrail. I pulled. Fire ripped through my chest. The broken ribs screamed against the tight medical tape. My breath hitched in my throat, a wet, ragged sound in the quiet room. I bit down hard on the inside of my cheek until warm copper flooded my tongue. Inch by agonizing inch, I dragged my battered torso upright. The steel brace on my leg weighed a ton and anchor trying to pull me under, but I forced the dead weight to move. I leaned over the edge of the mattress. My arm shook violently as I reached into the bassinet and scooped Leo up. I pulled his warm, fragile body against my good shoulder. He stopped crying almost instantly, his tiny fingers grabbing the coarse fabric of my hospital gown. I sat there in the dim light, gasping for air. The heavy manila envelope sat inches away. I was a 32-year-old amputee candidate, a single mother, and completely broke. Then my phone buzzed on the nightstand. The screen lit up, casting a harsh blue glow across the dark corner of the room. I reached over with numb fingers. It was an iMessage from an unknown number. Just a photo, no text. I tapped the screen. It was Richard. He was sitting in a leather booth at a high-end steakhouse downtown. His hand was resting high on the thigh of a blonde woman I recognized from his sales department. They were leaning into each other, laughing, holding expensive glasses of wine. But it wasn't the woman that made the blood freeze in my veins. It was the digital timestamp glowing in the bottom corner of the image. The photo wasn't taken today or yesterday. It was taken 6 months ago. 2 full months before my unit was even deployed. My brother David drove a beat-up 2012 Ford F-150. The cab smelled like motor oil, stale coffee, and wet dog. He didn't say a single word the entire ride from the civilian hospital. He just kept his eyes glued to the road, his jaw locked tight, his massive hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. He parked in the driveway of my house, our house. Binti's, Richard's, and mine. David walked around to the back, dropped the heavy tailgate, and hauled my steel wheelchair out of the truck bed. It hit the driveway concrete with a loud metallic clank. I dragged myself out of the passenger seat. The steel halo bolted into my left shin, locked into place. Pain flared up my leg, sharp and white-hot. I leaned heavily on the open truck door, waiting for my vision to clear. "I got you," David grunted. His voice was rough like gravel. He unlocked the front door and pushed it open. I rolled the wheelchair over the threshold. Then I stopped dead. The house was a corpse. There is a specific kind of silence in a house that has been gutted. It echoes. The tires of my wheelchair squeaked against the hardwood floor, and the sound bounced off the bare, empty walls. I pushed myself into the living room. The leather sofa was gone. The flat-screen television was gone. The heavy oak coffee table I bought with my first deployment bonus was gone. I looked at the wall above the fireplace. A pale rectangular patch of clean paint marked the exact spot where our large wedding portrait used to hang. Only a small bent nail remained. My training kicked in automatically. You clear a room by scanning the corners, reading the environment, looking for anomalies. I wheeled myself down the hall to the master bedroom. The walk-in closet door was wide open. The left side was completely stripped. All of Richard's tailored suits, his expensive Italian leather shoes, his silk ties. Gone. He wasn't packing in a hurry. Systematically removed. Bare wooden hangers dangled loosely from the metal rod. I looked down at the floor. A thin layer of gray dust covered the baseboards. He didn't pack up yesterday after he handed me those divorce papers. This took time. A moving truck. Planning. While I was sitting in the dirt in the Middle East, eating dry rations and sending my hazard pay straight into our joint checking account, my husband was slowly dismantling our life. He was liquidating our home. The doorbell rang. The chime sounded harsh and loud in the empty space. David answered it. I heard low murmuring. A minute later, a woman walked into the kitchen. Susan. She lived 2 doors down. She stood there clutching a glass baking dish covered in aluminum foil. Her eyes darted from my metal leg brace to the empty space where the heavy dining table used to sit. Pity! It rolled off her in waves thick and suffocating. Julia? Oh, honey, Susan whispered. She set the dish on the bare kitchen counter. I brought a casserole. I figured you wouldn't have time to cook. I stared at the foil. Thank you, Susan. She shifted her weight, crossing her arms nervously. I saw the moving guys last week. I asked Richard what was happening. He said you two were upgrading, buying a bigger place. I kept my face perfectly still. Is that what he said? Yes. She looked down at her tennis shoes. But then I saw him at the grocery store on Tuesday. He was buying expensive wine, and he wasn't alone. He gave the cashier an address for a delivery, a luxury condo downtown, the new high-rise. She didn't need to say anything else. I knew exactly what she meant. I appreciate the food, Susan, I said, flat, dismissive. She nodded quickly, eager to escape the heavy air of the room, and hurried out the front door. I peeled the foil back with one hand. Macaroni and cheese. I pinched a cold piece of pasta and put it in my mouth. It tasted like cardboard and cheap salt. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. I opened the message I had received in the hospital room. The photo. I stared at the blonde woman sitting next to Richard in that high-end steakhouse booth. I recognized her now, the junior sales director at his firm, the one he always claimed was too aggressive for his taste. I looked at the digital timestamp glowing in the bottom corner of the image. October 12th. My convoy was hit by the blast on December 4th. This was a classic Jody. The oldest, dirtiest story in the military. You deploy, you sweat, you bleed, you send your money home, and the person you left behind uses it to fund a double life. Richard didn't leave me because I came back broken. He didn't hand me divorce papers because he couldn't handle my injuries. He was already gone. He was eating $50 steaks with another woman while I was trying to keep the sand out of my rifle. My shattered leg and my crushed ribs, they were just a gift. A perfect socially acceptable excuse. He could walk away from a cripple and play the victim, claiming the stress was too much. He got to keep the money, keep his spotless reputation, and dump the heavy luggage. If you have ever been stabbed in the back by someone you gave everything to, you know exactly how cold this moment feels. Please take a second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below saying, I stand with you. It helps more than you know to see who actually understands this kind of betrayal. I didn't scream. I didn't throw the phone against the wall. Anger is a waste of energy if you don't focus it into a weapon. I pressed the delete button. The photo vanished. I rolled the wheelchair back into the living room. David had placed Leo's portable crib in the center of the bare floor. My son was awake, staring up at the ceiling, kicking his little legs. I looked at the heavy steel brace bolted to my shin. I looked at the dark bruises covering my arms. If I don't stand up right now, who is going to protect this boy? I locked the brakes on the wheelchair. I placed both hands on the plastic armrests. I dug the rubber heel of my good foot into the hardwood floor. I took a sharp breath, tasting the iron in the back of my throat, and I forced my broken body to rise. 3:14 a.m. The baby monitor on the kitchen counter cracked with static. Then came the scream. Leo had colic. It wasn't a normal baby cry. It was a high-pitched, jagged shriek that drilled straight into the base of my skull. I was in the living room. I hadn't slept in a real bed for 3 weeks. You can't lie flat when your ribcage is held together by surgical wire. Gravity pulls the heavy fractured bone fragments down, pressing them right into your lungs. So I slept sitting bolt upright in a cheap brown thrift store recliner. I opened my eyes. The house was pitch black. I reached out. My fingers brushed cold, hollow aluminum. The walker. I locked my jaw. I shifted my weight forward. Fire shot up my left leg, starting at the steel pins drilled into my shin and ending deep in my pelvis. On rainy nights, the cold dampness made the joints grind together like crushed glass. Tonight was raining. I gripped the foam handles of the walker. My knuckles turned white. 1. I pushed down, forcing my good right leg to take the brunt of the lift. 2. My ribs screamed. I stopped breathing just to keep my chest from expanding. 3. I was up. I dragged the aluminum frame across the hardwood floor. Squeak, thud, squeak, thud. Every step felt like wading through wet cement. Sweat pooled at the base of my neck, cold and clammy. By the time I reached the nursery, my hospital gown was clinging to my back. Leo's face was red, his tiny fists clenched tight. I locked the brakes on the walker. I leaned my weight entirely against the wooden rail of the crib. I reached down. My arms shook violently under his 12-pound weight. The fractured ribs ground against each other. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted hot copper. I pulled him to my chest. No one was clapping. There were no medals here, just the heavy, suffocating silence of an empty house and a broken woman holding a crying infant in the dark. 2 days later, I sat in the waiting room of the local VA clinic. The place smelled like bleach and stale coffee. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow on the cracked linoleum floor. Veterans sat scattered across the plastic chairs. Some stared at the walls. Some chewed on their thumbnails. Nobody talked. They called my name. I dragged the walker down the long, sterile hallway. Dr. Evans was 50 with deep bags under her eyes and a clipboard she treated like a shield. She didn't offer fake smiles. She didn't ask how I felt. She just looked at my charts. Bone fusion in the left tibia is slow, she said, tapping a pen against the desk. Ribs are healing, but you're pushing it. You need to rest, Julia. I have a 3-month-old, I said flatly. Rest isn't on the schedule. Evans put the pen down. She looked up, finally meeting my eyes. Where is the father? The question hung in the air, heavy and sharp. I looked down at my hands. The skin was rough, calloused from gripping the aluminum handles. He's gone, I said. My voice was hollow. He looked at this. I gestured to the steel brace. And he walked out. He didn't want to carry the dead weight. Evans didn't flinch. She'd seen 100 Jody cases. Wives leaving amputee husbands. Husbands abandoning burned wives. I swallowed hard. The thick knot in my throat made it hard to breathe. I look at Leo, and I wonder. Wonder what? I'm afraid he's going to grow up and hate me. I'm afraid he's going to look at this metal leg and think his father left because of me, because I broke. Evans leaned forward. She rested her elbows on the desk. Her eyes were hard, unblinking. Listen to me, soldier, she said, her voice dropping an octave. Kids don't remember the guy who packed a bag and walked away. They don't care about his excuses. They only remember the one who stayed. The one who bled for them. You hear me? I stared at her. The words hit me like a physical blow. The one who stayed. I nodded once. A short, sharp jerk of the chin. I didn't say thank you. I just grabbed the handles of my walker, stood up, and left the room. The pity party ended in the VA parking lot. The next morning, the alarm on my phone went off at exactly 05:30 hours. I didn't hit snooze. I didn't lie there wishing my body was whole again. I threw the thin blanket off my legs. I gripped the edge of the nightstand. I bypassed the aluminum walker entirely. I reached for the black wooden cane resting against the wall. It was time to apply military discipline to civilian survival. My leg was permanently ruined. My chest would ache every time it rained for the rest of my life. The man I married was a coward who sold me out for a cheap affair and an easy exit. Fine. I accepted the terms. I wrapped my fingers around the curved handle of the cane. I dug the rubber tip into the floor. I stood up. Pain laced up my spine, but I didn't stop to let it settle. I pushed forward. I walked out of the bedroom. I didn't drag my feet. I forced a brutal, jagged rhythm. Step. Plant the cane. Step. I reached the living room. I was panting. Sweat dripped down my forehead, stinging my eyes. But I was standing tall. I walked over to the portable crib. Leo was awake, looking up at me with wide, quiet eyes. I hooked the cane over my forearm. I reached down with both hands. I braced my core, ignoring the sharp protest of my ribs. I lifted him up smoothly, pulling him tight against my good shoulder. I didn't shed a single tear. I just held him. It was a blood oath made in the quiet of a ruined home. I would never give this boy a reason to doubt who fought for him. I turned and walked across the living room, carrying the weight of my son without a single groan. The sun hadn't even fully risen yet. The house was completely silent. Then 3 loud, heavy knocks pounded against the front door. The 3 heavy knocks shook the door frame. I didn't even have to look through the peephole. David walked in at 600. He wore a faded flannel shirt and work boots crusted in dried mud. He smelled like Folger's dark roast and Pennzoil. He didn't offer a hug. He didn't ask about the pain in my leg. He just dropped a heavy canvas tool bag onto the bare floorboards. He walked straight into the kitchen. The upper cabinet hinge had been whining for a week. He pulled a Phillips head screwdriver from his leather belt and went to work. Metal scraped against metal. "You good?" he grunted, eyes locked on the screw. "I'm good." That was it. That was the whole exchange. It was exactly what I needed. Richard used words to manipulate and deflect. David used his hands to fix things. My brother treated me like a soldier on light duty, not a broken victim. Later that evening, my parents would call on FaceTime, their faces pixelated but smiling, offering quiet support from 2 states away. I wasn't alone. I had a unit. A week later, my cell phone rang. Colonel Sarah, my old CO. "You done drowning heart?" her voice barked through the receiver. "I need a civilian logistics coordinator at the base. You know the supply chains better than anyone. Start Monday." I didn't hesitate. "Yes, ma'am." I hung up. I looked out the window at the driveway. Richard had left the luxury SUV. It swallowed gas and had a monthly payment I couldn't stomach. The next morning, I drove it down to a grimy used car lot on Highway 74. I handed the dealer the keys and drove off the lot in a 10-year-old Honda sedan. The AC rattled and the upholstery smelled like old tobacco. I didn't care. It was paid for in cash. I used the leftover money to put down a deposit on a narrow townhouse across town. The floorboards creaked. The kitchen was the size of a closet. The water pressure was a joke. But the deadbolts were heavy iron. It was a bunker, my bunker. Time didn't heal the injuries. It just built thick calluses over them. Leo turned 5. He had Richard's strong jawline and my dark eyes. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, he was sitting on the rug watching a cartoon where a dad pushed his kid on a swing. Leo turned around. He held a blue plastic block in his hand. "Mom." "Yeah, buddy. Why doesn't my dad love me?" The air vanished from the room. My hand clamped onto the edge of the cheap laminate kitchen counter. The plastic dug into my palm. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell him that his father was a narcissist, a coward who traded his own flesh and blood for a blonde junior executive and a downtown condo. I closed my eyes. I took a slow, measured breath. I limped over and sat on the rug beside him. My steel brace clunked against the floor. I looked him dead in the eye. "Your dad isn't a bad person, Leo," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "But sometimes people make terrible choices, and his choices have absolutely nothing to do with you." "Got it." He blinked, processed the information, and nodded. He went back to stacking his blocks. I stood up, walked into the bathroom, and shut the door. I turned on the sink faucet, gripped the cold porcelain, and stared at my reflection until the shaking stopped. I would not let Richard's poison infect my son. Fast forward 5 years. Leo was 10. He was tall for his age, built solid and quiet. We were eating dinner at the small wooden table David had sanded down and repainted for us. Leo was pushing a piece of chicken around his plate. He had a tryout for the local soccer team the next day, and the nerves were eating him alive. "I don't know if I'm fast enough, Mom. I'm scared I'll mess up the drills." I put my fork down. "Are you scared?" "Yeah." "Good," I said. "Fear keeps you sharp, but you know what bravery is." He looked up. "Bravery isn't not being scared," I told him, tapping the wooden table with my knuckles. "Bravery is making the decision to do the right thing even when your hands are shaking. You show up, you do the work." A small smile broke across his face. "Yes, ma'am." That night the house was perfectly still. The fridge hummed in the background. I sat on the couch rubbing my bad leg, sipping black coffee. We were safe. We were untouchable. A month later, Leo kicked the front door open. He dropped his backpack on the floor and sprinted into the kitchen, waving a crumpled white envelope. "Mom, I got in." It was the acceptance letter to the Youth Leadership Academy, a highly competitive, prestigious summer program. I grabbed him, pulling him into a tight hug. Pride swelled in my chest, warm and heavy. Then the doorbell rang. I let go of Leo. "Go wash up for dinner. I'll get it." I walked to the front door and pulled it open. A postal worker stood on the concrete porch holding a thick envelope and a clipboard. Julia Hart, need a signature for a certified letter. I grabbed the plastic pen and scribbled my name. He handed me the envelope. It felt heavy, too heavy. I flipped it over. The return address belonged to a high-rise corporate law firm downtown, and stamped right across the top of the seal in glaring red ink were the words, Family Court Division. I closed the front door. The deadbolt slid into place with a heavy metal thud. I stood in the narrow entryway of the townhouse, staring at the envelope in my hands. The paper was thick, expensive stock, the kind of paper that costs more per sheet than I spent on groceries in a week. The red ink of the Family Court Division stamp seemed to bleed into the fibers. My pulse hammered in my throat, thick and heavy. I walked into the small kitchen. The burner under the tea kettle was glowing bright orange. I hooked my thumb under the flap of the envelope and ripped it. The paper tore with a sharp, ugly sound. I pulled out a stack of watermarked legal documents. The heavy-duty staple in the top left corner gleamed under the flickering fluorescent ceiling light. I flattened the pages on the cheap laminate counter. My eyes scanned the header. In the General Court of Justice District Court Division. Then I read the bolded title block. Petition for full sole custody. Not joint custody. Not every other weekend. Full, sole, custody. I stopped breathing. The air in the kitchen turned to lead. My stomach bottomed out, dropping straight into the floorboards. Richard hadn't been a father in 9 years. He hadn't attended a single parent-teacher conference. He didn't know Leo's shoe size. He didn't know Leo was allergic to penicillin. He just wired his child support from a safe distance and lived his glossy, unbothered life in his downtown penthouse. But 3 weeks ago, Leo's name was printed in the Charlotte Observer for the Youth Leadership Academy acceptance. The academy was a pipeline for the elite. Suddenly, Richard's abandoned baggage was a shiny gold trophy, a status symbol he could parade in front of the senior partners at his firm. And a narcissist like Richard never let someone else hold the trophy. I turned the page. The legal jargon was cold, clinical, and completely devoid of humanity. I read the grounds for the petition. The defendant. Julia Hart exhibits severe physical limitations that restrict her ability to adequately care for the minor child and respond to emergencies. I gripped the edge of the counter. My knuckles turned stark white. The joints ached. Furthermore, the defendant suffers from documented chronic post-traumatic stress, rendering her home environment unstable, unpredictable, and potentially hazardous to the minor's well-being. Bile rose in the back of my throat. I tasted battery acid. He wasn't just trying to take my son. He was weaponizing the blood I left in the sand. While he was eating $50 steaks and sleeping with his junior executive, I was pulling 2 burning 19-year-old kids out of an armored transport in a combat zone. My leg was crushed. My ribs were shattered into jagged pieces. I survived. I dragged myself out of a hospital bed, forced myself to walk with a cane, and built a fortress for my boy out of sheer grit and a civilian logistics paycheck. And now, Richard was using the high-priced corporate shark he hired with his hoarded money to paint me as a crippled, mentally unhinged liability. He was using my service to the country as dirt to throw in a judge's face. He was turning my medals into mud. A low hiss started on the stove. The tea kettle. I stared at the black ink on the page. It wasn't just an insult. It was a calculated execution order. He wanted to erase my existence. The hiss of the kettle escalated into a high-pitched, piercing shriek. It drilled into my skull like a red alert siren. Mom! Footsteps slapped against the hardwood floor of the hallway. I panicked. I grabbed the thick stack of papers, folded them violently in half, and shoved them behind my back just as Leo walked into the kitchen. He was wearing his soccer cleats, a fresh grass stain on his left knee. He looked at the screaming kettle, then at me. "You okay?" he asked, his dark eyes squinting in the harsh light. I forced my facial muscles to move. I stretched my lips into a smile that felt like cracking plastic. "I'm good, buddy." I reached back with my free hand, killed the burner, and yanked the kettle off the hot iron grate. The sudden silence in the room was deafening. "Just looking at some boring tax stuff," I lied. My voice didn't shake. The military discipline held it steady. "Go wash the dirt off your hands. Dinner is in 10. Leo shrugged. Okay. He turned around and walked down the hall. I stood frozen against the counter, my arms pinned tightly behind my back, the sharp edges of the legal paper biting into my skin. I listened to his footsteps fade. I waited. Click. His bedroom door shut. The second the metal latch caught, the discipline evaporated. My knees gave out completely. I slid down the front of the cheap wooden cabinets until I hit the linoleum floor. The heavy steel brace on my leg clanked loudly against the baseboard. I brought the crumpled papers up to my chest, crushing them against my sternum. I clamped my right hand over my mouth to kill the sound. Tears spilled over my eyelashes, hot and fast, cutting tracks down my face. I squeezed my eyes shut, my chest heaving in violent, silent spasms. But I wasn't crying because I was scared. I wasn't crying because I was a broken victim about to lose everything. I was crying because of the sheer concentrated venom pumping through my veins. For 9 years, I had taken the high road. I had swallowed my pride and my anger so my son wouldn't grow up carrying his father's sins. I played fair. Richard wanted to play dirty. He wanted to use my war record to bury me. I wiped my face with the back of my hand. I looked at the crumpled red stamp on the envelope. Tomorrow morning, I was going to find a lawyer. And then I was going to burn his world to the ground. Margaret Hayes operated out of a strip mall off Independence Boulevard, sandwiched between a rundown laundromat and a discount liquor store. The waiting room smelled of burnt Folgers and damp industrial carpet. There were no mahogany desks here, no plush leather chairs, just stacks of yellowed case files and a secretary loudly chewing nicotine gum behind a smeared plexiglass window. Margaret was 50 with graying hair pulled into a tight, unforgiving bun. Her eyes looked like cracked flint. I sat in a wobbly plastic chair and slid the thick family court envelope across her scratched laminate desk. She put on a pair of cheap reading glasses. The only sound in the room was the heavy ticking of a battery-operated wall clock. Margaret flipped through the pages. Her expression remained completely flat. He doesn't want the kid, Julia. Won me, he filed for sole custody. I said, my voice dead level. He filed for a shiny object, Margaret corrected, dropping the papers onto the desk with a hard thud. This is corporate maneuvering. It has zero to do with fatherhood. They are using your medical discharge as a wedge to pry the boy loose. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk. Her eyes locked onto mine, stripping away any pretense. I need the absolute truth right now. Have you ever lied on a VA medical form, hid a diagnosis, swept a PTSD episode under the rug? I sat perfectly straight, my spine pressed hard against the cheap plastic chair. Absolutely not. Margaret held my gaze for 3 long seconds, searching for a crack. She found none. She took off her glasses. Good. Then let him dig his own grave. I treated the next 48 hours like a forward operating base deployment. The small dining room table became a war room. I didn't sleep. I barely ate. I built a fortress of paper. I pulled every dental receipt, every parent-teacher conference sign-in sheet, every pediatrician note from the last 9 years. I dug through dusty cardboard boxes to find the grocery receipts from the weeks I survived on ramen just to buy Leo his asthma inhalers. It was deeply, profoundly humiliating. I had left pieces of my bone and cartilage in a foreign desert for this country. Now I was forced to lay out my entire medical history, every painful physical therapy session, every prescription for nerve pain, just to prove to a man in a black robe that I was allowed to raise the boy I carried and bled for. I stacked the papers. The edges were perfectly aligned. A solid, impenetrable block of evidence. 9 years of showing up. 9 years of standing in the rain at bus stops. 9 years of paying the bills while Richard was buying expensive wine and taking weekend trips. Saturday morning, the community soccer field smelled of cut grass, wet dirt, and minivan exhaust. Leo was on the field wearing his oversized blue jersey running drills. I stood near the cold aluminum bleachers, leaning my weight heavily on my wooden cane. The damp morning air made the steel pins in my leg throb. A beat-up Ford F-150 pulled onto the gravel shoulder. The heavy door groaned open. David climbed out. He didn't walk over with his usual slow, heavy stride. He moved fast. His jaw was locked tight. He shoved a styrofoam cup of black coffee into my hand and leaned his broad back against the chain-link fence. The metal rattled under his weight. "I talked to Mike," David muttered. Mike was a mechanic who serviced the fleet vehicles for Richard's corporate firm. "And?" I asked, staring at the field. David had hit the steering wheel of his truck earlier. I could tell by the fresh red scrape across his knuckles. "Richard is up for a regional VP spot. The board is old school, traditional. They like family men, stable guys." The pieces clicked together, cold, sharp, and brutal. "He's been parading that academy acceptance letter around the office all week." David spat, his voice thick with disgust, telling the senior partners how proud he is of his boy, how he's bringing him to the company retreat next month to show him off. I stared at the coffee in my hand. The dark liquid trembled slightly. He didn't want a son. He wanted a prop, a human accessory to secure a corner office. He was willing to drag me through the mud, humiliate me in a public courtroom, and rip Leo out of the only safe home he had ever known, just to look like a family man for his bosses. David turned his head and spat on the gravel. "He's treating the kid like a damn Rolex." I didn't answer. I looked out at the field. Leo trapped the soccer ball, spun around a defender, and kicked it hard toward the net. He was smiling. A genuine, unguarded 10-year-old smile. I watched my son breathe in the cool morning air. The anger inside me stopped boiling. It froze. It turned into something heavy, dense, and absolute. Richard wanted a war. He thought he was fighting a crippled, exhausted single mother. He forgot he was fighting a logistics officer who survived a burning convoy. I tightened my grip on the handle of my cane until my knuckles ached. The green grass of the soccer field faded into stark white walls. The heavy oak door of the district deposition room swung open with a loud, echoing crack. I stepped inside. The air conditioning was freezing, and Richard's lawyer was already sitting at the long mahogany table, smiling like a butcher. The deposition room felt like a meat locker. The air conditioning blasted through an overhead vent, raising goosebumps on my bare arms. The only sound in the sterile windowless box was the harsh, rhythmic clack, clack, clack of the court reporter's stenographer machine. Richard sat directly across the wide mahogany table. He wore a navy blue Brioni suit that cost more than my first car. He spent the entire first hour scrolling through emails on his phone, his thumb flicking casually across the screen. He acted like he was stuck in a boring airport terminal, not a legal proceeding designed to rip a child away from his mother. His lawyer, a guy named Vance, paced the industrial carpet. Vance wore a silk tie, a pair of $1,000 loafers, and a smug smirk that made my hands itch. He had a copy of my VA medical file open on the table. The pages were highlighted in bright yellow ink. Ms. Hart. Vance started stopping right across from me. He placed his hands flat on the table. "Let's discuss your medical discharge. You were retired from active duty due to severe physical trauma and post-traumatic stress." "Yes." I didn't blink. I kept my posture military straight, shoulders back, chin level. "It says right here you suffer from hyperarousal, startle responses." Vance tapped a manicured fingernail against the paper. "Do loud noises frighten you? A car backfiring in the neighborhood, a heavy door slamming shut." He was laying a trap. He wanted me to sound jumpy, unhinged. He wanted it on the official record that I was a liability. "I am trained to react to sudden noise," I said. My voice was completely flat. "It keeps people alive." Vance let out a short, patronizing laugh. It echoed off the bare walls. "We aren't in a combat zone, Ms. Hart. We are talking about raising a 10-year-old boy in a quiet suburb. Do you have nightmares?" Margaret sat next to me. She didn't object. We had prepped for this exact ambush in her strip mall office. I just had to take the hits and hold the line. "Occasionally," I answered. "So this trauma..." Vance leaned further over the table, deliberately invading my physical space. "This war experience, it negatively impacts your daily life. It makes your home an unpredictable, potentially hazardous environment for a child." I looked right through him. I didn't see a high-priced corporate shark. I saw a cheap interrogation tactic. "I remember the day my convoy was hit," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the annoying buzz of the fluorescent lights. "I remember the heat. I remember the smell of burning diesel. But I have never missed a parent-teacher conference. I have never been late to a soccer game. I have never neglected my son. Richard finally looked up from his phone. He shifted in his expensive leather chair, suddenly uncomfortable. He refused to meet my eyes. Vance's jaw tightened. The mental instability angle wasn't working. I wasn't cracking. He switched magazines. Let's talk about your physical state. Vance pointed that same manicured finger at my wooden cane resting against the edge of the table. You have a fused tibia. Extensive shrapnel damage to your pelvis and rib cage. You walk with a pronounced limp. I do. You cannot run. I stared at him. The air in the room grew heavy, thick. I want you to imagine a scenario, Ms. Hart, Vance said softly, the tone of a predator closing in on wounded prey. You are at a public park with Leo. He runs toward a busy street. A car is speeding toward him. He's in immediate life-threatening danger. You cannot physically sprint to save him. Can you? It was a kill shot. A deeply sick, twisted psychological blow designed to break a mother in half. He wanted me to cry. He wanted me to break down in front of the court reporter and admit I was broken, useless merchandise. He wanted to strip my dignity bare. My ribs ached. The cold air made the steel pins in my leg throb with a dull, sickening pain. I didn't shed a single tear. I didn't break eye contact. I placed my rough, calloused hands flat on the polished mahogany. I leaned forward, forcing Vance to hold his ground. If my son is in danger, I said, grinding every single word out like crushed gravel, my body will be in absolute agony. It will feel like it is tearing apart. But I guarantee you, Mr. Vance, I will still be the first person to reach him. Silence. The court reporter stopped typing. Her hands hovered frozen over the keys. Vance's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. His smug, aggressive posture evaporated entirely. He looked down at his notes. Then he looked at Richard. Richard was staring at the blank wall. I had just sucked every ounce of oxygen out of their expensive little room. If you've ever had to sit across from someone trying to tear you down and you refuse to let them break you, you know exactly how satisfying this moment was. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. I want you to drop a comment below and type, "I won't break," if you've ever had to fight back against a bully. Your support means everything to me. Margaret calmly capped her cheap plastic pen. She closed her yellow legal pad with a sharp, satisfying snap. She didn't even bother looking at Vance. She just looked at me and gave a tiny, almost invisible wink. If counsel is finished playing hypotheticals, Margaret said, her voice dripping with pure, unadulterated boredom, I believe we are done here. The psychological torture was over. We survived the ambush. 3 weeks later, the heavy wooden doors of the district courthouse swung open, hitting the stops with a loud bang. All rise, the bailiff barked. The real war had finally begun. The industrial air conditioning in courtroom 4B blasted cold air straight down the back of my neck. The room smelled like lemon floor wax, old paper, and stale desperation. Judge Sterling sat high on the heavy oak bench. She looked exhausted, peering down through thick reading glasses. Vance stood at the wooden podium. He didn't use a scalpel to dissect my character. He used a sledgehammer. For 60 straight minutes, he paced the thin industrial carpet and butchered my name. Unstable, physically compromised, a ticking liability. He loved the word crippled. He leaned into the microphone every time he said it, making sure the hard consonant cracked through the courtroom speakers. He painted a vivid, terrifying picture for the judge. A broken veteran haunted by nightmares, physically incapable of running down a street, ready to snap at any given moment. A clear and present danger to a 10-year-old boy. I didn't react. I kept my back military straight against the unforgiving wooden chair. My steel leg brace rested heavily against the scuffed table leg. The cold air made the deep bone aches flare up, but my face was a mask of stone. I held a cheap plastic pen, taking precise block letter notes on a yellow legal pad. Let him talk. Let him dig. I shifted my eyes across the center aisle. 2 entirely different realities separated by 10 feet of carpet. Richard sat at the petitioner's table. He wore a bespoke charcoal Brioni suit. The thick gold face of his Rolex caught the harsh overhead lighting every time he checked the time. His new wife sat in the front row of the gallery directly behind him. She wore a tailored skirt suit and a string of real heavy pearls. The scent of her expensive Chanel perfume drifted across the aisle, cloying and arrogant, cutting right through the sterile courtroom air. Then there was my side of the table. I wore a gray blazer I bought off a clearance rack at a department store. My shoes were sensible scuffed flats. Resting on the table in front of me was a battered, peeling cardboard accordion folder. Inside that ugly folder was 9 years of blood, sweat, and absolute survival. 9 years of grocery receipts, late-night emergency room discharge papers for asthma attacks, and perfect parent-teacher conference attendance logs. While Richard was buying sports cars and high-rise condos, I was counting pennies at the gas pump to make sure my son had cleats for soccer season. Vance finally sat down. He shot Richard a smug, victorious grin. Margaret stood up. She didn't grab a legal pad. She didn't adjust her suit. She just walked to the center of the room and locked her flinty eyes on Richard, who had been called up to the witness stand. "Mr. Hart," Margaret said. Her voice was completely flat, carrying perfectly in the dead quiet of the room. "You are petitioning this court for sole full custody of Leo. You are testifying that you are the superior, more capable parent." "Yes, I can provide a stable, traditional, and financially secure home," Richard said smoothly. He adjusted his silk tie, rehearsed and polished. Margaret didn't blink. "What size shoe does your son wear?" Richard stopped. His hand froze on the knot of his tie. "Excuse me." "Shoe size, Mr. Hart. Your son is 10 years old. He grows fast. What size cleats did he wear to his soccer tryouts last week?" I don't handle the shopping. My assistant usually." "What is the name of his primary care pediatrician?" Margaret fired the second shot before the echo of his excuse even faded. Richard shifted his weight in the heavy wooden chair. A bead of sweat formed at his hairline. "Doctor Miller, I believe." "Doctor Miller retired 4 years ago," Margaret stated coldly. "What is Leo severely allergic to?" Richard looked past Margaret, his eyes darting toward Vance's table. Vance was staring down at his legal pad, his jaw clenched tight. Peanuts," Richard guessed. His voice cracked. "Penicillin," Margaret corrected. The word snapped through the air like a whip. "A common everyday antibiotic. If a doctor prescribes it and you give it to him, his throat closes. He stops breathing. You didn't know that." Richard swallowed hard. His face flushed a dark, ugly, blotchy red. The polished, untouchable corporate executive was completely gone. He was just a hollow deadbeat, sweating profusely under the fluorescent lights exposed for the fraud he was. "What was the exact date of his last birthday party?" "October." "That is a month, Mr. Hart. I asked for the date." "I was traveling for a very important business merger." "You were in Aspen," Margaret said. She didn't yell. She didn't need to. The quiet disgust in her voice was lethal. "You have not attended a single birthday in 9 years. You don't know his doctors. You don't know his shoe size. You don't know what medicine will kill him." Margaret turned her back on him, dismissing him entirely. She walked slowly back to our table. "I have no further questions for this witness, Your Honor." Richard practically scrambled out of the witness box. He looked physically sick. Vance sprang to his feet. He was losing total control of the narrative. The wealthy father angle was dead. He needed a kill shot. He needed to prove I was fundamentally broken. "Your Honor," Vance said, his voice loud and tight. "The defense is playing emotional parlor tricks. We are dealing with a severe psychological hazard here. The defendant's military medical history clearly demonstrates profound violent trauma. I petition the court to unseal defendant's Exhibit C, the classified military psychological evaluation from her final deployment." Margaret sat perfectly still next to me. She didn't raise an objection. She just stared at the judge. Judge Sterling frowned, looking down from the bench. "Mr. Vance, those are heavily restricted federal files. They are highly relevant to the physical safety of the minor child. Your Honor," Vance pushed, pointing a stiff finger at me. "The court needs to see exactly how mentally broken she is. It is in the file." Judge Sterling sighed. She nodded to the court clerk sitting below her. The clerk stood up. She walked over to a heavy steel filing cabinet, unlocked the bottom drawer, and pulled out a thick brown manila envelope. Across the front, stamped in bold faded red ink, was the word, "Classified. Do not duplicate." The clerk walked up the wooden steps and handed it to the bench. Vance smiled. A nasty, victorious smirk spread across his face. He thought he had the smoking gun. He thought he had my madness officially documented on government paper. Judge Sterling picked up a heavy silver metal letter opener from her desk. The entire courtroom went dead silent. The heavy breathing from Richard's table stopped. You could only hear the low hum of the air conditioner. The judge slid the sharp metal blade under the sealed flap of the envelope. Ripe! The metal letter opener sliced through the heavy brown paper. It was a sharp, ugly sound. Ripe! The overhead fluorescent lights let out a low, annoying hum. Nobody moved. The heavy air conditioning blasted down from the ceiling, freezing the sweat on the back of my neck. Richard sat up straighter in his bespoke charcoal suit. He shot Vance a cocky look and adjusted his silk cuffs. He was waiting for the kill. He was waiting for the judge to pull out a piece of government paper with the words, "Mentally Unhinged," stamped across the top. Judge Sterling pulled out a thin stack of documents. The top sheet bore the dark official watermark of the Department of Defense. She adjusted her reading glasses. She scanned the first page. Her eyes tracked left to right. Then she stopped. Her brow furrowed. She looked up from the page, her gaze locking onto Vance. The air in the room suddenly shifted. It got very thick. "Mr. Vance," Judge Sterling said, her voice dropping a full octave, "are you familiar with the contents of this classified addendum?" Vance puffed his chest. "I have not seen the sealed portions, Your Honor, but we infer based on her medical discharge." "Stop inferring," she snapped. It was a crack of thunder. She picked up the document. "I am reading this into the official record," she announced. Her voice boomed, echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "Incident report, December 4th. Convoy hit by an improvised explosive device. Lieutenant Colonel Julia Hart sustained severe blunt force trauma, multiple rib fractures, and extensive shrapnel lacerations to the left lower extremity." I closed my eyes. The sterile smell of the lemon floor wax vanished. I tasted the grit of the sand again. The heavy, suffocating stench of burning diesel and melted tires. The copper tang of blood flooding the back of my throat. Despite catastrophic injuries, the judge continued, her voice gaining a hard, undeniable edge. Lieutenant Colonel Hart refused medical evacuation. She established a defensive perimeter and manually extracted 2 critically wounded subordinates from a burning transport vehicle. She remained in an active kill zone until civilian bystanders were secured. Dead silence. The court reporter's fingers flew across the keys. That was the only movement in the entire room. Judge Sterling flipped to the second page. The psychiatric evaluation, the exact paper Vance swore would prove I was insane. Post-deployment psychiatric evaluation, she read loud and clear. Patient exhibits symptoms of post-traumatic stress. However, field reports and stress tests indicate that under extreme life-threatening pressure, the patient displays exceptional mental stability, superior judgment, and 0 cognitive degradation. Recommendation: highly fit for command. I opened my eyes. Richard's face was the color of wet ash. All the blood had drained out of his skin. The smug corporate arrogance was completely gone, replaced by raw, naked shock. His mouth hung open slightly. "That's..." Richard stammered. His voice was weak, barely a whisper. "That's impossible." Vance was panicking. He snatched his copy of the unsealed file off the mahogany table. His eyes darted frantically over the black ink, searching for the loophole, searching for the word crazy. It wasn't there. His shoulders slumped. The high-priced corporate shark looked like a deflated tire. He slowly took off his tortoiseshell glasses, folded the arms, and dropped them onto the table with a soft clack. A silent, absolute surrender. Judge Sterling wasn't finished. She dropped the military file and reached for the battered accordion folder Margaret had submitted. My 9 years of survival. "Mr. Hart," she said. It wasn't a statement. It was a judicial execution. "You came into my courtroom, hired an expensive attorney, and demanded sole custody based on the physical and mental limitations of this mother." She held up a thick stack of paper. I have in my hand 9 years of public school attendance logs. She has a 100% sign-in rate at every parent-teacher conference. She grabbed another stack. I have logs showing she volunteered at the PTA bake sales chaperone field trips and sat in emergency rooms for asthma treatments at 2 in the morning, all while walking on a shattered leg. Judge Sterling leaned forward over the heavy oak bench. Her eyes bored holes straight through Richard's expensive suit. Your ex-wife is an injured veteran who proved her psychological stability under enemy fire, she stated, her voice cold as ice. I have scoured this file, Mr. Hart. I have looked at your financial records. The only thing I see here is documented irrefutable evidence that you voluntarily abandoned your own son for a decade to protect your own comfort. Richard swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed. He didn't say a word. He couldn't. His new wife, sitting in the gallery behind him, stared at the back of his neck in horrified silence. The glossy illusion was dead. The legal battle was over. The corporate maneuver was completely destroyed. But Judge Sterling didn't reach for her wooden gavel. She didn't officially dismiss the petition. Not yet. Instead, she looked past the plaintiff's table. She looked past the wooden barrier dividing the room. Her eyes found the front row of the gallery, where David sat with his large calloused hands resting on his knees. Sitting right next to him was Leo. The judge softened her expression. The hard authority melted away. Leo, come up here for a second, son. The 10-year-old boy stood up. He walked down the center aisle, the squeak of his sneakers breaking the dead air silence of the courtroom. He stopped right in the middle of the room, standing exactly between my table and Richard's. Judge Sterling looked down at the boy. Your father says he wants you to come live with him, she said quietly. What do you want? Leo stood in the dead center of the courtroom. His oversized sneakers squeaked against the polished hardwood. He was 10 years old, small for his age, surrounded by high-priced lawyers, heavy oak furniture, and the suffocating chill of the air conditioning. Judge Sterling leaned over the bench. Her expression softened. Your father says he wants you to come live with him. What do you want, Leo? Leo didn't look at Richard. He didn't look at the expensive lawyer. He kept his hands shoved deep inside his denim pockets. Last January. Leo started, his voice quiet but steady. I had a bad asthma attack. It was 2 in the morning. There was ice on the road. Mom's old Honda wouldn't start. Richard stared at the floor. Vance stopped taking notes. I couldn't breathe, Leo said. Mom wrapped me in a blanket. She carried me 4 blocks to the emergency clinic. Her leg brace was broken. It cut right through her jeans. She left blood on the snow all the way to the sliding doors. The court reporter's hands went still. Leo finally turned his head. He looked directly at Richard. Mom told me once that soldiers never leave their squad behind. She never left me. You did. He turned back to the judge. I'm staying with my mom. Judge Sterling didn't ask for closing arguments. She didn't look at Vance. She grabbed her heavy wooden gavel. The plaintiff's petition for sole custody is denied in its entirety. Her voice rang out hard and absolute. Supervised visitation is granted strictly at the discretion and consent of the minor child. We are adjourned. Bang! The sound of the wood hitting the block echoed like a gunshot. The war was over. We walked out through the heavy glass double doors of the courthouse. The mid-morning spring sun hit my face bright and blinding. The air smelled like hot asphalt and exhaust from the city buses. David was waiting at the bottom of the marble steps. He didn't say a word. He just wrapped his massive arms around my shoulders and pulled me into a crushing hug. He smelled like motor oil and stale coffee. The tension in my spine, wound tight for 9 agonizing years, finally snapped. I let out a long, ragged breath. Footsteps approached on the concrete. I turned around. Richard stood a few feet away. His polished armor was completely gone. His new wife was nowhere to be seen. The bespoke Brioni suit hung awkwardly on his frame, suddenly looking too big, too heavy. His face was pale. The arrogant corporate shark who walked into that courtroom an hour ago was dead. He looked at me. Then he looked down at Leo. A single tear cut a track down Richard's cheek. It wasn't a calculated courtroom performance. It was a raw, ugly release of guilt. I ran. Richard whispered. His voice cracked dry and pathetic. When you got hurt? When you came back in that wheelchair. I was terrified. I couldn't handle it. I ran away because I was a coward. I'm sorry. He didn't ask for a hug. He didn't step forward. He just stood there letting the sun beat down on his shame. Leo stepped out from behind David's leg. He looked up at the man who gave him half his DNA. Forgiveness is a choice, Leo said. He sounded exactly like a soldier. You can call me on Sundays, we can talk. But you don't get to just show up. We go slow. Richard nodded, his shoulders shaking. Okay, slow, I promise. We walked away, leaving him standing alone on the marble steps. Fast forward 8 years. The townhouse driveway was packed with cardboard boxes. The air was thick with the humid heat of a late August afternoon. Leo was 18. He was built like a linebacker, a full head taller than me. He stood by the open tailgate of a battered Ford pickup truck, throwing a heavy canvas duffel bag into the bed. He was leaving for the state university on a full ROTC scholarship. A lot changes in 8 years. Richard didn't get his regional VP promotion. The firm let him go quietly. He traded his Rolex for a mop. Every Saturday morning, he drove down to the local Veterans Affairs Center, scrubbing floors and serving coffee to disabled vets. He was paying off a debt he knew he could never afford. Leo slammed the heavy metal tailgate shut. It rattled on its rusted hinges. He turned around and walked up to the porch where I was standing. He reached out and pulled me into a tight embrace. I got it from here, Mom, he whispered against my hair. I know you do, I said. I stepped back. I watched him climb into the driver's seat. The engine sputtered, caught, and roared to life, spitting a cloud of dark exhaust into the hot air. He put the truck in gear. The tires crunched loudly over the gravel driveway. I didn't wave. I just watched the red taillights disappear around the corner, leaving nothing behind but the smell of burnt rubber and dust. I turned around. I walked inside the empty house. I closed the front door, and for the first time in 17 years, I left the heavy iron deadbolt unlocked. If you felt this journey, please hit like, leave a comment below, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for your support. I will see you in the next story.